job, and also some of the easiest to avoid. And there's a reason that happens. Today, I'm going to break this pattern down behaviorally so you can see what's actually happening when these tasks keep getting delayed and what needs to change to make them easier to do. Imagine it's Tuesday morning. You sit down at your computer and you tell yourself you're going to start the reassessment that's been on your list. But before you begin, a few other things catch your attention. Maybe you answer a quick email. Maybe you respond to a text from an RBT. Maybe you reorganize a folder or check your schedule. None of these things are unreasonable. They're part of your job. But now I'm curious. When you sit down intending to start a high effort task like a reassessment or report, what usually happens first? Do you start the task immediately, handle a few quick tasks first, check messages or email, delay the task until later? Most clinicians choose B or C, and behaviorally that makes perfect sense. But let's look at why. Research on procrastination shows a similar pattern of procrastination in students. Tice and Baumeister, 1997, found that procrastination often reduces stress in the short term, but it leads to significantly higher stress as deadlines approach. Other research also linked procrastination with higher stress over time. For example, Seros 2014 found that people who procrastinate more tend to experience greater stress and emotional strain. Chronic stress is also one of the primary contributors to burnout. In most widely used model of burnout, Musblock and Leiter 2016 describe emotional exhaustion resulting from prolonged stress as the central component of burnout. When important work repeatedly gets delayed until urgency appears, the resulting stress and time pressure can begin to contribute to that cycle. Before we go on, I just want to stop and introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me yet, I'm Amelia Dalphonse. I'm a BCBA and I co-founded Master ABA with my twin sister, Diana Kelly. Through Master ABA, we help BCBAs gain confidence in their skills so they can have a greater impact with their learners. Our focus is on ethical, compassionate, client-centered practices. This course is eligible for CEUs. You must watch the video all the way to the end. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you have to go to our website to register to get your CEUs. There will be a short quiz after the lesson. You must pass this quiz to receive your CEU certificate. The quiz is what releases your certificate, not marking the lesson complete at the bottom. Once you pass the quiz, you will get a link to a brief survey. I appreciate your feedback because this helps me improve the courses that I'm creating. If for some reason you miss a step or have any trouble with your certificate, email me at support@masteraba.com. I'm happy to help with anything you need. When I first passed the BCBA exam, I stepped into a role overseeing 2 clinics inside a larger nonprofit. They were relieved to have me come into that role, but very quickly I realized something else. None of the 26 clients had adequate behavior plans. Parent training wasn't documented and not usually even offered. Staff weren't trained as RBTs yet. They hadn't even figured out how to bill for any of the BCBA codes. I remember making list after list, but the lists didn't solve the real problem that I was experiencing because the real problem wasn't knowing what needed to be done. It was not having a system for deciding when to complete the important tasks like documentation, what tasks to do first, how to structure my workday, or even how to make consistent progress without feeling completely overwhelmed. I was headed quickly toward burnout and wanted to figure out how to stay in the job that I actually really loved, but that was quietly killing me. I started looking for resources that would help me get through all that I needed to do. During that time, I learned a ton about procrastination and productivity. And before we go on, I want to share what the research says about the connection between procrastination and stress. We might see procrastination as a personality trait, but it can actually be a short-term self-regulation strategy that we use unintentionally that actually increases our stress in the long run. In a longitudinal study, Tyson Baumeister, 1997, found that people who procrastinate often experience lower stress early on, but significantly higher stress as the deadline approaches. Other research has shown a similar pattern. In the other study that I mentioned, Sorois 2014 found that procrastination is associated with higher levels of stress over time, which can contribute to emotional exhaustion, which is one of the contributions to burnout. And in a large meta-analysis of procrastination, Steele 2007 found that procrastination is most likely when tasks require high effort, provide delayed rewards, and compete with more immediate reinforcing activities. Those conditions describe many of the tasks that clinicians face every single week. So rather than thinking about procrastination as a personality trait or a lack of discipline, it can be more helpful to look at the conditions surrounding the work that actually promotes procrastination. When those conditions are present, a very predictable pattern tends to appear in our workflow. Gradually, I stopped trying to power through the whole list every day. I started designing structure. I learned to prioritize differently. I built repeatable systems. I delegated tasks that didn't require a BCBA to complete them. I stopped relying on urgency to get me to finish important tasks. And when the structure changed, the outcomes also changed. The clinics needed less of me moment to moment. Staff developed important skills, families felt supported, the program grew, but what stands out to me now isn't just the growth that happened, it's how much of the early overwhelm came from not having a framework for organizing the work that I had to do. And that's what I want to help you overcome today. We're trained extensively in how to analyze behavior, but very few of us are taught how to analyze our own work behavior. For a lot of BCBAs, some of the most important work that we do, including reassessments, evaluations, documentation, planning, all of those things end up being the easiest things to delay. Not because they aren't important, and not because we don't understand the stakes for our learners and the families if we don't get them done, but because these tasks are high effort, cognitively demanding, and usually the least immediately reinforcing tasks on our giant to-do lists. Meanwhile, there are dozens of other things all day long that provide faster reinforcement or demand our immediate attention. This might be solving a quick problem, replying to a message, supporting a an RBT in the moment, checking off something that's small. Those are real needs. They also compete very effectively with the tasks that aren't necessarily screaming for our attention. But the work doesn't just disappear. It piles up. The deadline gets closer. Stress builds, and urgency becomes the thing that finally gets us to do those tasks that we've been putting off for a month. Urgency works, but it's expensive. It costs us our evenings, weekends, sleep, patience, and sometimes clinical presence. Today is about building a system where you don't have to rely on that cycle. For now, I want you to pick one task that you tend to delay the longest. And this might be reassessments or reports, supervision documentation, staff evals or feedback write-ups, parent training planning, programming updates, or treatment plan edits. Keep that one task in mind while we go through the process that I'm teaching you. You're going to use that throughout this course, so you're able to use the framework at the end of our time together today. I want to talk to you about a pattern that a lot of us cycle through, sometimes weekly. A task shows up. It might be a reassessment, some other documentation. Maybe you have an intake that you need to write up or a staff evaluation. It's an important task, and it requires really concentrated, focused time. You know it needs to get done, but it's complex, or it's going to take a long time, or it might not even be obvious where you need to start. And there are other things in front of you that are easier to get started with. So that task just sits. This pattern also appears in procrastination research. In the the meta review by Steele 2007 found that procrastination is most likely when the tasks involve high effort, delayed rewards, and more immediately reinforcing alternatives. In the short term, that delayed task often works for you. It reduces your immediate discomfort. It buys you relief for the moment. You get rewarded with those other tasks. Then time passes and the deadline gets closer. It stays in the background of your brain and the pressure continues to build, even if you're not immediately aware of it. Eventually, that pressure gets high enough because of the impending due date that you just decide you have to push through, usually all at once, and usually outside of your usual work hours. This is the avoidance cycle that most of us go through on a regular basis. Most BCBAs are very capable of doing high quality work under urgency. But when you finish that task, there's relief. The pressure drops off and you get a brief reprieve. And that reprieve is very reinforcing. It makes it more likely that you're going to delay the same task, the same type of task next time you have to get that done, because you've learned that you will get it done eventually and you're going to feel relief when it is done. So take a moment and think of that one task that you chose for this presentation. Just notice it. Think about how you respond when that task shows up. And if it has a due date, how your response to the task shifts as the due date gets closer. Pause the video if you need to, but take the time to really think about this task and how this cycle applies to that task. When this pattern repeats week after week, something else starts to happen. Important work sits in the background of your mind for days or weeks. It's unfinished, but it's still taking up mental space. Eventually, the deadline approaches and the work gets done, often in a very concentrated push. The task gets completed, but it required urgency, pressure, and a lot of cognitive energy all at once. When that pattern repeats across reassessments, documentation, supervision notes, and reports, the work can start to feel harder than it actually is. And it's not because you don't care about the work, but it's because the conditions surrounding the work repeatedly procrastinate until the task becomes urgent. Over time, that urgency cycle can contribute to burnout. So now that you're aware of the reinforcing cycle or delaying those tasks we don't like, the question becomes, what are we going to do about it? And that's what we're going to actually go through today. We're going to do two things. First, we're going to understand the cycle in a way that makes sense behaviorally. So this stops feeling like a personal flaw and it starts feeling like a predictable outcome of the conditions that you're working in. And second, we're going to shift those conditions because from a behavioral perspective, meaningful change comes from changing the variables that make the behavior more or less likely to occur. And the goal here isn't to turn you into a productivity machine. The goal is to make the important work that you have to do, but don't necessarily want to do, easier to start and easier to finish. So it doesn't linger all week and then follow you home at the end of the day on Friday. If you're noticing some resistance come up, like thoughts of your schedule being completely impossible, or you not actually having any control over when you're pulled away from these tasks, that's completely valid. We're not going to ignore those. We're going to work with those situations directly. So why does this cycle happen so consistently? The answer is actually pretty simple, and it's made of variables that you already think about all day long when it comes to your clients. The first is response effort. Some tasks require sustained cognitive effort, not just a few minutes, but hours of sustained concentration. Holding a ton of information in your mind, pulling data, writing clearly, making clinical decisions, checking for quality. Even when you're competent, it's hard to sustain that level of effort for that amount of time. The second variable is delayed reinforcement. The payoff for finishing a reassessment is real, but it's very delayed. The same is true if you're submitting the company's billing or documenting supervision. You don't get immediate reinforcement other than the task coming off your to-do list. You don't get that true feeling of being done until the end. And sometimes the immediate consequences is just mental fatigue. So the third variable I want to talk about is competing contingencies. All day long, there are tasks that provide faster reinforcement, quick answers, quick fixes, quick closure, supporting an RBT, replying to a parent, solving a scheduling issue. Some of these are clinically important, and they are also compete very effectively with the more complex tasks for your attention. So the pattern makes sense from a behavioral perspective. The tasks you delay are often the ones with the highest response effort, the least immediate reinforcement, and the most competition for your attention. Now, take that task you chose earlier and ask yourself, which of these three variables is driving your avoidance of the task the most right now? Is it effort, delayed reinforcement, or competition for your attention? Is it something else? Obviously, these are not the only three possible variables, but they are absolutely some of the most common. And just notice what stands out. Now that we've looked at these three variables, let's apply them to a real situation. A BCBA sits down to write a reassessment. After about 10 minutes, they stop writing and begin answering messages, helping staff, and reorganizing some of their data. Nothing urgent is happening, but the writing still stops. So here's the question. Which variable is most likely influencing this behavior? Is it response effort, delayed reinforcement, competing contingencies, or all three? If you said D, you're probably correct. It's all three working together. The task requires high effort, the payoff is delayed, and there are easier tasks available immediately. That combination makes delay very predictable. When we notice that we procrastinate on completing specific tasks, most of us try the same solutions that we've tried in the past. We tell ourselves we just need to push harder or get better with time management. We stay late. We take the work home with us. We wait until we feel motivated enough to focus on the task. Or we hold out until the due date is close enough that we finally have no choice but to get started. And to be fair, these strategies can work in the short term. You do get it done and you meet the deadline. But behaviorally, they don't solve the problem and it's burning you out because none of these strategies change the variables we just identified. The task is still high effort. The reinforcement is still delayed. The competing contingencies are still everywhere. So the cycle continues to repeat. Do you use any of these fixes when you have tasks that need to get done? So if pushing harder doesn't work in the long term, what actually does? A different approach is to stop trying to change your personality and start changing the conditions under which you work, because you already know this is how behavior works. When response effort goes down, starting the task gets easier. When reinforcement is more immediate, or at least more visible, persistence increases. When you create small wins early, momentum builds, and momentum is something that's really powerful. The goal is to design your workflow so important tasks become easier to start, easier to continue, and less likely to pile up in the first place. And once we do that, urgency stops being your main motivator for getting stuff done. From here, I'm going to give you a framework that's simple, behavioral, and realistic that helps you change those conditions one step at a time. I call that framework SPARK. Each step is based on behavioral principles you already use every day with your clients. The only difference is that we're applying them to your own workflow instead of the learner or your supervisee. So SPARK stands for shrink the start, protect your time, add reinforcement, remove friction, and keep momentum. What I want you to notice immediately is that none of these steps require you to become more disciplined or focused. They require you to design your week and your work differently. Before we go further, I want to be clear about what this framework is not. This is not about hustle culture. This is not about optimizing you into exhaustion. This is not about squeezing more billable hours into your week. The purpose of the Spark framework is not to make you work harder or faster. It's to change the conditions around the work so that important tasks no longer depend on urgency to get done. If anything, Spark is about protecting you from the long-term costs of working in a constant state of urgency and pressure. When the conditions support starting earlier and progressing gradually, the work becomes much more sustainable. That shift reduces the pressure that contributes to burnout. When important work piles up, the quality suffers. Decision-making becomes rushed or reactive. Clinical creativity disappears, and eventually clinicians just leave the field. That's not a motivation or a discipline problem. That's a sustainability problem. Spark is designed to reduce the friction around high-effort tasks, decrease reliance on last-minute urgency, protect cognitive bandwidth, and ultimately support better care for our autistic learners and their families. Because when your workflow is chaotic or ineffective, it affects more than your personal stress level. It affects the supervision quality, it affects treatment planning, and it affects how present you can be for your clients, staff, and families. And when your workflow is designed well, you don't just feel better about the work that you do, you actually practice better. Before we dive into the first step, look back at the tasks that you identified earlier. As you look at the 5 Spark steps, which one intuitively feels most relevant to that task right now? Just notice what your instinct tells you matters most to that specific task. We're going to start with the first step of the framework, which is shrink the start, because if we can't get started, we can't finish anything. And one of the biggest barriers to getting important work done isn't confusion, it isn't incompetence, and it isn't even time. It's the size of the starting point. When a task feels huge, like when you're staring down a reassessment, your brain registers hours of sustained cognitive effort. Multiple data sources, clinical reasoning, writing clearly, reviewing, editing. You're tired before you even get started. This is a very high response effort. And behaviorally, when response effort is high, we know that initiation can decrease. But here's what's interesting. Often the barrier isn't the whole task. It's the way we've defined the beginning of that task. If the starting point feels large, you will be resistant to starting the task. If the starting point feels small and feels manageable, you're more likely to get started. Research on implementation intentions shows that defining a specific starting action significantly increases the likelihood that a behavior will occur. For example, Goldwitzer 1999 found that specifying exactly when and how a behavior will begin increases follow through. And that's what we're manipulating with this step. Shrinking the start doesn't mean finishing the whole task in one session. It means redefining what the beginning of the task looks like. Instead of planning to work on the reassessment that's due in 2 weeks, you want to define the first observable behaviors that will accomplish your end goal. So the first observable steps might be just to open the template, pull up the last assessment report, outline section headings, write just the background paragraph, and just set a 10-minute timer for those tasks. Notice how different those feel. Working on the assessment is abstract and it feels hard. The other list is concrete and finite, and you have a defined end time. Behaviorally observable actions are easier to initiate than more global intentions. And something important happens once you start that task. The task itself starts to change. Before starting, the work exists in your head. It feels large, undefined, and slightly aversive or really aversive, depending on your experience with these tasks. You've probably been telling yourself how much you really don't want to do the task, and you're feeling the dread. After starting the task, it becomes concrete. You see words on the page, you make one decision, you finish one small section, you begin contacting reinforcement, and that small shift makes a huge difference. Take that one task from earlier. What is the smallest possible observable first step for that particular task? Not not necessarily something that's even meaningful, not the first meaningful step, just that first manageable, measurable step. Let yourself make it smaller than you think that it even should be. There's another behavioral principle at play in all of this, and that's behavioral momentum. We use high probability sequences with our learners because once behavior is flowing, it's easier to keep it going. The same thing applies to your own workflow. Starting changes the contingencies for any task that's high effort, has a delayed payoff, and that you have a history of avoiding. After you begin the task, you start to notice immediate micro progress. You have visible momentum, and what you need to accomplish becomes more concrete. Momentum builds from contact with small reinforcement. That's why often once you get started, continuing becomes easier, not because you're suddenly more disciplined, but because the contingencies have shifted. You want to make 3 shifts in the way that you approach the tasks you've been avoiding. First, define the first step before you sit down to start the task. Don't rely on in-the-moment decision-making. Get really clear about what your goals are for just starting the task. Second, lower the bar intentionally. 20 minutes spent on focused work gets things done. One section completed at a time builds momentum. Opening the document counts as a first step if that's all that's manageable for you in that moment. And finally, third, begin earlier than you normally would. Don't wait for urgency to make you get started. It's so tempting to wait until you absolutely need to get it done, but then you don't have a choice about how you start the task. You're just going to have to muscle through the whole task and finish it. That's what we're trying to avoid. If you wait until the stakes are high, you're still relying on the old cycle, which is what we already said causes burnout. Starting when the task still feels small makes a huge difference in how you perceive the task over time. Now let's apply this to a reassessment that's due in 3 weeks. I chose this task because it's literally my least favorite task to do, just because I've done so many of them and it feels enormously tedious. This is literally how I managed to get through them. So instead of saying I'll work on it next week, which believe me is always very tempting, I can shrink the start of the task to be just opening the previous assessment and doing a save as to create the new document. Then I can work on updating the psychosocial section of the assessment. This part is usually really manageable for me because I care about what's happening in the lives of my clients. It doesn't feel as tedious to me. I can set a 20-minute timer. If I'm not planning to finish the whole task, I'm just making it easier for future me to actually get it done. And that's systems design. Take the time to think about the task you've been thinking about and consider how you might shrink the start of that task. Pause the video if you need to, make it concrete, make it observable, and make it small. So let's test this idea for a minute. Imagine you need to complete a staff evaluation. You've been putting it off for a few days because you know it's going to take some focused time. Now think about the first step. Which start actually lowers response effort the most? Finishing the staff evaluation, reviewing the staff performance data, opening the evaluation template, and writing just the first paragraph, or scheduling time to work on it later. If you answered C, that's exactly right. The option creates a clear, tiny starting behavior. It doesn't require finishing the task. It just gets the work moving, which is the whole point of shrinking the start. If shrink the start makes tasks easier to begin, protect your time makes it possible to continue. Here's something most of us were never explicitly taught. Don't actually find time to do deep work. If time isn't intentionally protected, something else will consume it. We all have 24 hours in a day, and the loudest task usually gets the attention. And it makes sense that it does. Throughout your day, there are constant competing contingencies and demands for your time. Staff have immediate questions that need answers. Parents make requests or they need support. Emails and phone calls need to be answered. Scheduling changes need your attention. Many of these are clinically important, and they also provide faster reinforcement than sitting alone, writing a report, or completing staff evals. So if you rely on the belief that you'll work on it when you have time, what usually happens? Your time gets filled because stimulus control favors what's in front of you. So protecting your time is not about willpower. It's about environmental design. When we talk about protecting time, we have to address something that most of us believe is true. A lot of clinicians feel like multitasking is what makes them effective. You answer an email while reviewing data. You take a quick supervision question while drafting a report. You toggle between writing and messaging because it feels efficient. It feels productive because you are responding to multiple demands. But task switching is not neutral. Research on task switching shows that shifting attention between tasks increases the cognitive load because the brain has to reconstruct the task each time we return to it. For example, Rubinstein, Meyer, and Evans, 2001, found that switching between tasks introduces measurable time and accuracy costs. Every time you shift from writing a reassessment to answering an email, your brain has to reorient. It has to drop one set of rules and load another. That shift carries a high cognitive cost. It doesn't feel like a cost in the moment. It feels like responsiveness, but the effort accumulates over time. When you're working on a high effort task like a reassessment, your brain is holding multiple pieces of information at once. It's thinking about treatment integrity and skill acquisition progress, clinical reasoning, risk assessment, insurance compliance, family context, and all of the other things that go into a reassessment. When you switch away from that task, even briefly, you don't just pause it. You partially dismantle the mental structure that you were building. There's consistent research in attention science that shows that task switching increases total completion time and error rates. We don't experience task completion as slower because we're active the whole time, but the output quality and the total cognitive effort tell a very different story. In ABA language, switching increases response effort and reduces sustained engagement. When you come back to the task, you have to rebuild that mental structure that you walked away from. That rebuilding is what increases response effort. And when response effort increases, just like we said a few minutes ago, the likelihood of continuing the task decreases. And that's why people often say, oh, I lost my train of thought, or I just can't get back into it. It's not a motivation problem. It's a re-entry cost problem. Multitasking feels productive because you're busy. Deep work feels slower because you're focusing on just one thing. But deep work produces higher quality output with less total cognitive drain over time. Protecting your time isn't about becoming rigid. It's about creating stimulus control so your environment signals that you should be doing this task right now. When your email is open, notifications are active, and staff interruptions are expected, your environment signals something different. It signals that you should respond to what appears in front of you in that moment. And behavior follows the SD. You all know this, but it feels really different to put it to work for ourselves. So protecting time means deliberately shifting stimulus control. That means saying that for this particular window of time, the environment's going to support just one task, this really important one. Not because you're inflexible, but because you understand how attention actually works. Think about the last time you tried to write a report while responding to messages. How many times did you switch contexts? How did it feel when you tried to return to the report? Did it feel easier or harder than when you first started? How about this training? How many times have you responded to something else while the video is playing? Or did you have to pause it to handle something that came up? Just notice that pattern for a minute. Let's look at a situation that happens constantly in clinical work. A BCBA blocks an hour to work on a reassessment. During that hour, they answer 3 staff messages, reply to an email from a parent, and respond to a quick supervision question. They still spend most of the hour working on the report, but something subtle is happening. What is the main behavioral impact of this behavior? Does it increase efficiency? Does it have no real impact? Does it increase response effort, or does it help the task get finished faster? The correct answer is C. Every interruption forces your brain to reconstruct the task when you return to it. That restart effort adds up and makes the work feel harder than it actually is. When we talk about protecting time, it's important to acknowledge something honestly. Many clinicians truly feel like there isn't time to protect. Caseloads are huge, staffing turnover is high, parents need support, insurance deadlines are looming. So when you hear someone suggest that you just block your calendar, it can land disconnected from reality. This isn't about pretending the constraints of your role don't exist. It's about recognizing that if all of your time is structurally reactive, your work will always feel reactive. If every hour is available to be interrupted, then interruption becomes the default condition. Protecting time does not mean building an ideal week. It means identifying what is realistic within your control. For some clinicians, that might mean protecting just 1 hour a week. For others, it might mean 2 30-minute windows. For someone in a high-intensity clinic, it might mean protecting the first 45 minutes of one morning each week before supervision begins. The protection doesn't have to be large to be meaningful. It has to be intentional. And there's something subtle that happens here. If the only cue your nervous system has for starting high-effort work is urgency, then urgency becomes the trigger, the SD to getting the work done. When you begin protecting your time before the deadline is actually looming, you are training yourself to respond to a different cue. You're teaching your system that deep work can begin without the pressure of a deadline. And that's not time management, it's stimulus control. Now imagine a different structure to getting a treatment plan done. In week 1, you schedule just 2 hours, whether that's a solid 2-hour block or 4 30-minute blocks or something in between. You set aside that time. During that time, you conduct the actual assessment and organize your data sources. In week 2, you schedule another 2 hours. You systematically begin to update the template one section at a time, getting through as much as time allows without interruption. In week 3, you schedule another block of time so you can refine, edit, and finalize the treatment plan. This works if you can accurately estimate the time it will take to finish the task, but that's a bit of a different skill, and we're not going to get into that here. Through the process, you haven't increased the total amount of time required to complete the assessment, but you've redistributed the cognitive load. Instead of one long, high-pressure marathon, you've created 3 contained, predictable work periods. And notice what changes. The task no longer lives in the background of your mind for those 3 weeks. You're not relying on adrenaline to get it done. You're not trying to hold the entire report in working memory at once. You're building it gradually. And because the time was protected in advance, you didn't have to negotiate with yourself when the moment came up. That's the deeper function of protecting time. It reduces in the moment decision making, it reduces task switching, and it reduces the need for urgency to do the heavy lifting. This works even when you have multiple plans due at once. If it actually almost works a little bit better when you do, you can block out time for each of them to complete the same parts of the task for each client. You'll be completing the same type of tasks together, which is actually easier on your brain. Before you move on, take a moment to consider your own delayed tasks. If you were to distribute it across the next 2 or 3 weeks, what would that look like? Not in an ideal world, but in your actual reality. Protecting time removes interruptions, but it doesn't automatically make the work feel reinforcing. You might sit down during a protected block, open the treatment plan, and know exactly what you're supposed to do. The structure is there, the task is clear, and still the work can feel mentally draining. And that's not unusual. Many of the tasks BCBAs delay, including treatment plans, reassessments, those reports, require sustained attention and careful reasoning. You may work for 20 or 30 minutes and still feel like you got nothing done. So even when the conditions are good, the work itself may not provide much immediate reinforcement. And that's where the next step of the framework comes in, and that's add reinforcement. Not because we don't understand reinforcement as a concept, but because most of us have never intentionally designed reinforcement for our own work behavior. When we talk about adding reinforcement, we're not trying to make treatment plans fun. For some people, they enjoy that and that's fun, but whatever task it is, we're not looking to make the task itself fun. Some parts of clinical work are simply effortful for us. That's part of the responsibility of the role. What we can do is design the work period so that reinforcement happens along the way instead of only at the very end of the task. One way to do that is by pairing the work with a preferred context. Maybe report writing always happens in your favorite with your favorite coffee. Maybe you have a playlist you only use during focused work blocks. Maybe you work in a very specific quiet location where you can concentrate. Those kinds of pairings can make it easier to begin and easier to stay with that task. Another way to add reinforcement is to create small, repeatable reinforcement points during the work period. Instead of expecting yourself to stay engaged for hours with nothing but delayed payoff, you define a specific amount of work that you have to complete before you reward yourself with a short break or a preferred activity. For example, you might decide that after completing 2 sections of a treatment plan, you take a 5-minute break. During that break, you might check a game on your phone, step outside, grab a snack, or do something that actually feels enjoyable. The key is that the reinforcement happens after a clearly defined amount of work. That structure creates a repeatable pattern of effort followed by reinforcement. Over time, that pattern supports persistence much more effectively than expecting the task itself to carry all the motivational weight. For reinforcement to work, it has to be easy to access and meaningful enough that you're going to actually follow through with it. If the reward requires a lot of effort, you're going to just skip it. If it feels artificial or forced, you're going to abandon it quickly. All of this is the same stuff we use with our kids. Often the most effective reinforcement is simple and immediate. Like I said, it could be a short game on your phone, a favorite snack, or just spending 5 minutes outside or 5 minutes in peace and quiet. A quick scroll through something that might be enjoyable, or even a short conversation with a colleague after finishing a few sections of your document. The goal isn't to avoid the work. The goal is to create a rhythm where the effort is followed by something positive, often enough that staying engaged becomes easier. And that's the behavioral principle that we're going to use when we design reinforcement schedules for skill building. Let's say you've protected 30 minutes to work on a reassessment. You know the task itself probably won't feel very reinforcing while you're doing it, so you decide to add reinforcement to the work period. Which structure is most likely to help you stay engaged? Work until the entire report is finished before taking a break? Work for 30 minutes and then take a 5-minute break? Work only when you feel motivated? Or wait until the end of the day to reward yourself? The correct answer, I'm sure you got, is B. Reinforcement that occurs during the work process helps maintain persistence instead of relying only on the reward of finishing the entire task. We understand this for our clients, yet we don't apply it to our own work. Now, think about the task that you identified earlier. If the task itself is not especially reinforcing, and many of them aren't, what reinforcement could you build into the process? What could follow a small portion of that work? Not at the end of the task, but after a portion of the task. And if you're worried about task switching and this, and breaking it up to add reinforcement, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can arrange that so that when you come back to the task after your break, you can get right back into it. You want to make sure that you're defining a specific work interval or a specific step in the process you need to complete. Just like with our kids, you'll find that if you do it after a certain amount of work rather than a time amount, you're going to get more work done in a more efficient way. So take a moment and think about what that reinforcement might look like. This will help you design conditions that make it easier to stay with a task that requires sustained effort. And that's exactly the kind of behavioral thinking that we're going to apply in every other part of our work. Even when time is protected and reinforcement is available, tasks can still stall for a simple reason. And the process itself is inefficient. You sit down to start a task, and the first 10 minutes are spent getting ready. You're looking for the correct template. You're pulling data from multiple places. You're searching for language you wrote in a previous report. None of these things are difficult, but they interrupt the flow of the work. Each interruption forces a small reset. And when that happens repeatedly, the task feels harder than it actually is. So removing friction means reducing those small resets so that once you begin, the work can move forward smoothly. When we talk about friction in our workflow, it often isn't the formal structure of the task that causes the problem. In many cases, the expectations are actually very clear. Treatment plan templates are structured. Insurance requirements are defined. Supervision documentation has specific components. You generally know what needs to be included. The friction tends to appear in the conditions surrounding the task, not the task description itself. Sometimes it shows up when the information you need isn't immediately accessible. You sit down to review data, you prepare for supervision or update a program, and the first part of your work becomes locating the information that is in multiple different places. Other times, friction appears when there isn't a clear personal workflow for completing the task. Two clinicians might produce the same supervision note or treatment plan, but the sequence of steps they follow to get there may be very different. Without a predictable process, you end up deciding in the moment what you're going to do next. Friction can also appear during the clinical decision-making parts of the work, reviewing assessment data, identifying priorities, writing individualized goals, preparing feedback for staff, or deciding how to adjust programming all require thoughtful judgment. When those decisions happen while you're also trying to document the work, the cognitive load increases quickly. And sometimes friction shows up through task switching, like we talked about earlier. You begin reviewing data, then respond to messages, then return to the task, and you have to reconstruct your thinking before moving forward. So none of these moments mean that the task is unusually difficult. They simply represent points where the response effort increases, and those points are often where the avoidance begins or kicks in. When we start to notice where friction appears in our own workflow, we can begin adjusting the conditions around those specific moments so the work flows more smoothly. Before we can remove friction from a task, we have to identify where it actually occurs. We label a task as writing a treatment plan or completing a reassessment. But those are not single behaviors. They are complex chains of much smaller behaviors. When a task feels difficult to start or difficult to continue, the friction usually is located at a specific point in that chain. But if we treat the whole task as one large unit, we never see where the friction is actually happening. So instead of asking, why is this report so hard to finish? A more helpful question is, where do you consistently get stuck or decide to leave the task? Is it when you begin reviewing assessment data? Is it when you start translating that information into individualized goals? Is it when you need to synthesize multiple data sources? Or is it when you're trying to make clinical decisions about priorities? The point isn't to judge where the friction is. The point is to locate it so you can take steps to change the conditions around that part of the task. One simple way to do this is to observe your own workflow the next time you complete one of these tasks. Instead of focusing on finishing quickly, pay attention to where friction enters your process. Notice the moments when you stop making progress. Maybe you pause because you're searching for information. Maybe you pause because you're unsure about the next clinical decision. Maybe you pause because the next step requires a different type of thinking than the previous one. Those pauses are important information. They tell you where the response effort is high. And once you know where that point is, the solution becomes much more targeted. Instead of trying to change everything about the tasks you've been avoiding, you can adjust the conditions around that specific step that is creating the friction. That's the same way we approach behavior analysis in every other context. We identify where the problem occurs, and then we design the environment to support that moment. Imagine a BCBA sits down to update a treatment plan. The first 15 minutes looks like this. They search for the previous assessment report. They pull session data from 2 systems. They review notes from a supervision meeting. The work hasn't really started yet, but a lot of effort has already been spent. Where is the friction actually occurring? Is it in writing the report, clinical decision-making, information organizing, or lack of motivation? If you said C, again, you're right. The effort is happening before the writing even begins, when the information isn't organized ahead of time. The task starts with searching instead of writing. Once you've made a task easier to start, protecting the time to work on it, added reinforcement during the process, and reduced friction in the workflow, one final piece becomes very important, and that's momentum. Many of the tasks we delay aren't difficult because of a single work session. They become difficult because each time we return to them, it feels like we're starting over. You open the document again, and you have to remember what you were doing, what decisions you had already made, and where you left off. That re-entry process increases response effort. And like we said, that's what we're trying to get rid of. When response effort increases, the likelihood of continuing the task and actually getting it done decreases. Keeping momentum means designing your workflow so that each time you return to the task, it feels like continuing rather than restarting. So the best way to preserve momentum is to end each work session at a clear point that makes the next step obvious. Instead of stopping where you're completely finished with a section, you might stop after outlining the next piece you plan to write. You might leave a note to yourself describing what you want to add in that next step. You might highlight the next paragraph you plan to complete during the next focus session. These small indicators make the next session easier to begin because you know where you're starting and you already have some prompts to get you thinking about what you're going to add. We often believe that we're just going to remember where we left off, and that's not often the case. When you return to the task, after leaving yourself cues and clues, then you don't have to decide what you're going to start with. You simply continue where you left off. And that goes back to that first step, shrinking the start. You already know very clearly what your start is going to look like when you come back to the task. That small shift reduces re-entry effort and helps the work pick up momentum more quickly. One of the most powerful shifts you can make is realizing that momentum doesn't come from long work sessions. It comes from making it clear where you should start the next time you come back to the task. When you end a task with a clear plan for where to start and return to it in shorter, predictable blocks of time. I mean, this is harder when you've got 3 weeks in between when you ended one session and you start a next one. So if you can do it more predictably, it gets easier. You take less time to get back into that task. And this helps you finish the task much quicker than you otherwise would have. Instead of relying on one large push near a deadline, the work develops gradually. Each session builds on the previous one. And because you're not repeatedly starting from zero, the task begins to feel easier. Not because the work changed, but because the conditions supporting the work changed. Think again about the task you've been using throughout this training. If you applied the 5 steps we just discussed, you would shrink the starting point so the beginning feels easier. You would protect specific time so the task actually happens. You would add reinforcement so you're more motivated to complete the steps. You would remove friction so the process flows more smoothly. And you would keep momentum so each work session builds on the last one. Take a moment to imagine what that task would feel like if those conditions were in place. It wouldn't be effortless, but it would be more manageable. That shift from dread to manageable is what this framework is designed to create. So let's apply this to a situation many of us face. We have 3 reassessments due in 3 weeks. And again, I apologize for those who might like reassessments. It's a challenge for me. So those are my examples, but this actually applies to any type of task that you're trying to avoid. The reports feel large and time consuming, so the BCBA continues to procrastinate. She knows they need to get done, but can't bring herself to actually work on them. Which Spark step should they apply first? Shrink the start, protect the time, add reinforcement, or remove friction? If you said A, you're correct. The first step is to shrink the start so the task feels concrete and manageable. Once that first step is defined, it becomes much easier to protect time for that specific piece of the task and actually begin. Now that we've walked through the Spark framework, the next question is, what does actually looks like in real life? Understanding the ideas is helpful, but the real shift happens when this process becomes a habit. To make that easier, I've created a small set of tools you can use to apply the process to your own work. Some of these are worksheets you can use immediately. Others are examples that show how the framework translates to real clinical tasks. The goal of these resources is simple: to help you take one task that tends to sit on your list and move it through the Spark process. The first resource is a short workbook that walks you through the process step by step. Inside the workbook, you're going to find a few simple tools: a 1-page visual of the Spark framework so you can quickly review the process, a task analysis template that helps you break down any task you've been avoiding into smaller, more observable steps, a friction finder worksheet that helps you identify exactly where the process tends to slow down, and a reinforcement planning page to help you decide how you'll support yourself during the long work blocks. These aren't meant to be complicated planning tools. They're just a way to make the thinking process more visual so you can adjust the conditions around your work more intentionally. Another tool that some clinicians might find helpful is something that we're building called Master Your Week. One of the patterns that we see often with BCBAs is that the challenge isn't just starting individual tasks. It's understanding how much work actually fits into your week. When the total workload exceeds our capacity, everything begins to feel urgent and reactive. This tool helps clinicians step back and look at their week more intentionally. It allows you to review your current commitments, identify priorities, track recurring responsibilities, and see where the hours you've planned actually fit within the time you have available. This tool helps clinicians create the work-life balance by creating habits to support their boundaries and improve their efficiency so their work doesn't follow them home. We're rolling this out to members of our dojo community first on April 10th, 2026. If you want to be among the first to get access to this, check out the dojo. I'll put the link in the description. Otherwise, you'll have to wait for it to become publicly available. Before we wrap up, it's worth acknowledging that understanding a framework and actually using it are two different things. Even when something makes sense, there are often real barriers that make implementation harder than it sounds. Sometimes the barrier is timing. You may already have several large tasks due at the same time, and the idea of restructuring your workflow feels unrealistic in the middle of all that pressure. Sometimes the barrier is expectations of your workplace. Your organization may have established procedures, documentation timelines, or productivity expectations that limit how much flexibility you feel like you have. And sometimes the barrier is habit. Many of us have spent years completing work under urgency. So even when we have the opportunity to start earlier, our brain still waits for that pressure to activate. And sometimes the barrier is simply the cognitive load. When your week is already full of decisions, it can be hard to step back and redesign how you approach your work. None of these barriers mean the framework won't work. They simply mean that implementation often just starts small. If you're looking at your current workload and thinking, yeah, this sounds great, but my situation is different, then you're probably right. So instead of trying to change everything all at once, start by adjusting the smallest piece of the process. If you have several large tasks due soon, begin by shrinking the start on just one of them. Even 10 minutes of an early progress changes the conditions around the task. If your workplace has strict expectations, focus on the steps that are within your control. You may not be able to change the deadlines, but you can still organize information earlier, protect a small block of time, or reduce friction in the process. If urgency has been your main motivator for years, recognize that changing that pattern takes repetition. Sorry. Each time you begin earlier than usual, you are building a new cue for starting. And if your week feels too full to redesign your workflow, begin by observing the process rather than changing it. Notice where friction appears and where the task slows down. Those observations are often the first step toward meaningful change. The goal is not to perfect the system immediately. The goal is to make the new task slightly easier than the last one. The goal of this framework isn't to eliminate effort from work. Clinical work will always require thinking, judgment, and time. The goal is to reduce how often important work depends on urgency to happen. When tasks feel easier to begin and the progress becomes more predictable and visible, the pressure surrounding the work starts to decrease. Over time, that shift can make the workload feel more manageable and reduce the patterns that contribute to burnout. And that wraps it up for today. I hope you walk away with the tools you need to finally get those dreaded tasks done in a way that feels easier. I'm excited to have a chance to share this with all of you today. This has been a huge focus of my work and is an important part of how I get everything done that needs to be done. If you're watching this for CEUs, you will need to complete the quiz. Once you pass the quiz, there will be a link to a brief survey. Please take a minute to complete it and let me know what you thought of this course. It helps me improve the courses I'm offering. Make sure to email us with any questions at support@masteraba.com. Thank you for joining me today, and I